October 1941. Montreal, Quebec. The sound of riveting hammers echoes through Montreal locomotive works as workers complete the first ram tank, a homegrown Canadian cruiser designed to match anything the Germans could field. Engineers inspect the Continental R975 engine, the cast turret, the 6-pounder gun. On paper, it is everything a modern tank should be. But thousands of miles away, Allied armies are already standardizing on the M4 Sherman. The ram will never fire its main gun in anger. Commanders expect these hulls to serve as trainers, then fade into obsolescence. Yet in storage yards across Britain, row upon row of surplus rams sit under canvas, waiting. No one yet realizes that Canada's redundant tank will become something far more valuable. By 1944, a field workshop and one imaginative general will transform these idle hulls into a weapon that reshapes infantry warfare, not through firepower, but through protection and mobility. An acceptance sheet lay on a desk at Montreal Locomotive Works on the 1st of October, 1941. The document listed a pilot ram Mark I leaving the production line, 400 horsepower from a Continental R975 radial engine, a cast turret mounting the quick-firing 6-pounder gun, and armor ranging from 25 to 87 millimeters. Canadian engineers had built a credible medium tank, mechanically sound and tactically capable. The specifications matched contemporary cruiser tank doctrine. The Ministry of Munitions and Supply authorized full production. But the war moved faster than manufacturing committees. Across the Atlantic, the British Directorate of Tank Design had already committed to American production. The M4 Sherman offered standardization, parts commonality, and volume that no single Commonwealth factory could match. Canadian armored regiments would train on rams, then deploy with Shermans. The rams' role contracted before the first hull left Montreal. Production continued anyway. From November 1941 through July 1943, Montreal Locomotive Works completed 2,032 ram tanks. Workers fitted Continental engines, installed turrets, and tested drivetrains. Each hull received the same attention to mechanical reliability that had defined Canadian industrial standards since the Great War. Armor thickness varied by position, 25 millimeters on the deck, 87 millimeters on the glacis, but every ram could sustain 40 kilometers per hour on roads and traverse rough ground with the same automotive performance as the Sherman. War Office assessments, summarized in standard references, described the ram as mechanically sound but strategically redundant. Training units absorbed a few hundred. The rest went into storage. By mid-1943, depot inventories showed hundreds of rams preserved in yards across southern England, their guns cosmoline-coated, their hulls covered against the weather. A contemporary summary noted the paradox bluntly. Canada had produced thousands of tons of armor, but frontline infantry still rode to battle in unarmored trucks. The problem was doctrinal as much as material. Tanks carried guns. Trucks carried men. Infantry divisions moved on wheels, then dismounted to assault on foot. Armored divisions used tanks and half-tracks, but those vehicles supported mounted cavalry tactics, not rifle companies. Between the two lay a gap, a tactical space where infantry needed the mobility of armor and the protection of steel, but doctrine provided neither. In Britain, training exercises during the winter of 1943 and 44 highlighted this gap repeatedly. Infantry brigades advanced behind rolling barrages, only to bog down under German counter-battery fire. Casualties mounted during the approach, before the assault even began. Universal carriers offered some protection, but their 10 to 12 millimeters of armor stopped small arms. Nothing more. Half-tracks were scarce, and their open tops left passengers exposed to airburst shells and shrapnel. Canadian staff officers reviewed the exercises. Reports crossed the desk of General H.D.G. Crerar, commanding the 1st Canadian Army. Depot inventories still listed hundreds of rams, good hulls, reliable engines, no combat role. Someone noted that the armor protecting an obsolete gun could just as easily protect a dozen riflemen. The idea sat in files through the winter. No one moved on it yet. By February 1944, depot inventory sheets at Borden and Chilwell listed rows of preserved rams awaiting issue. Clerks updated the records monthly. Training value recognized. Release to combat units. Not planned. The rams remained in storage, their potential unrealized, while infantry battalions prepared for the invasion of France knowing they would cross the beaches and the hedgerows on foot, exposed to every German gun within range. The material solution existed. The doctrinal insight had not yet arrived. Across southern England, in ammunition depots and tank parks, thousands of tons of idle armor waited for someone to see past the gun and recognize the value of the hull itself. The depots at Borden and Chilwell held more than rams. Rows of universal carriers, stacks of spare tracks, and hundreds of half-tracks and trucks filled the inventory. Quartermasters tracked every piece of equipment as the Allied buildup for Operation Overlord accelerated through the spring of 1944. Everything had a purpose except the rams. Their status reports remained unchanged. Available, mechanically sound, no assigned role. Pre-invasion exercises along the southern coast grew in scale and realism. Infantry brigades rehearsed beach assaults, advancing under simulated fire, coordinating with engineers and armor. After-action reviews recorded the same problem repeatedly. Heavy casualties during the approach phase, before infantry could close with German positions. Rifle companies crossed open ground at walking speed, vulnerable to observed artillery, mortar fire, and machine guns. The universal carrier offered some answers. Its low profile and light armor, 10 mm maximum, provided concealment and protection against rifle-caliber rounds. But carriers held only 3 or 4 men, and their thin steel crumpled under artillery fragments. Half-tracks seated more troops but remained scarce in Commonwealth service, and their open tops left passengers exposed. The gap persisted. Infantry needed protection during movement, not just at the objective. Canadian planners understood the arithmetic. A rifle company assaulting across 500 meters of open ground under fire could lose 30% of its strength before reaching the German line. Bring the same company forward in armored vehicles, dismounting under cover at 100 meters, and casualties during the approach dropped to near zero. Combat power arrived intact. The assault began with full strength. The solution was obvious. The tools were at hand. What remained was someone willing to ignore the doctrinal categories that separated tanks from transports, guns from hulls, armor from infantry. That insight would come from Normandy under fire in the summer of 1944. But in February, the rams still sat under canvas at Borden and Chilwell, officially surplus, practically idle. Depot guards walked past them daily. Maintenance crews checked preservation monthly. No one suggested pulling the turrets and welding on benches. The irony was documented in contemporary references. Canadian engineers had built a tank good enough for combat. Allied logistics had made that combat role unnecessary. But the hull, the automotive system, the armor protection, the mechanical reliability remained as valid as ever. The ram had not failed. It had simply arrived at the wrong moment in the wrong form. Its value lay dormant, waiting for battlefield necessity to force the question, what else could a tank hull do? By late March, the invasion date firmed up. Training intensified. Infantry battalions practiced dismounting from landing craft, crossing beach obstacles, advancing through minefields. Every exercise ended the same way. Infantry on foot, crossing open ground, taking casualties from positions they could not yet reach. Staff officers filed reports. Commanders read summaries. The problem was clear. The solution sat in storage, unclaimed and overlooked. The decisive moment approached, though no one yet recognized it. Across the Channel, the Wehrmacht prepared defenses in depth, concrete bunkers, layered minefields, pre-registered artillery zones. They expected the Allies to follow doctrine. Tanks forward, infantry behind, rifle companies on foot across the killing ground. That expectation would shape German defensive planning right up until the moment the first Kangaroo rolled forward in August, carrying infantry inside armor, rewriting the rules as it moved. The invasion came on the 6th of June, 1944. Allied forces stormed ashore across 5 Normandy beaches, breaking through the Atlantic Wall under overwhelming firepower and mass. Canadian troops landed at Juno Beach, pushing inland through fortified villages and hedgerow country. The battle for Normandy became a grinding attritional struggle, German defense in depth against Allied material superiority. By mid-July, Canadian 2nd Corps held positions south of Caen, preparing for a breakout offensive. Lieutenant General Guy Simons commanded the corps. His after-action files from earlier operations crossed his desk daily, each one documenting the same tactical problem: infantry casualties during the approach phase before the assault began. Rifle companies crossed open ground on foot, under observed fire, losing men to artillery and machine guns before they could close with German positions. Simons read the reports and considered the means at hand. His tank regiments operated Shermans, 30-ton hulls, automotive reliability, armor sufficient to defeat most German anti-tank weapons at range. His artillery had Priest's M7 self-propelled guns, essentially a 105mm howitzer on a Sherman chassis. Both vehicles moved cross-country at tank speed. Both provided armored protection. The Priests, in particular, offered space. Pull the howitzer, and the hull became a covered box on tracks. The idea was direct: convert self-propelled guns into armored personnel carriers. Use tank hulls to deliver infantry. Let the armor move troops forward, dismounting them under cover at assault range. Simons drafted the order. Number 1 Canadian Army Troops Workshop received instructions to begin conversions immediately. Priority: make the first vehicles operational within days. Workshop crews began with Priests. They torched off the 105mm howitzer, stripped out the gun mount, welded plates over the fighting compartment, and fitted simple bench seats. The conversions required no sophisticated engineering, just cutting torches, welding equipment, and fitters willing to improvise under deadline pressure. The first modified Priests emerged from the workshop on the 7th of August 1944. They were ready just in time for Operation Totalize. Totalize launched on the night of the 7th of August, a corps-scale offensive aimed at breaking through German defenses south of Caen. Simons planned a night attack under artificial moonlight, using searchlights reflected off clouds to illuminate the advance. Tanks and infantry would move together, protected and coordinated. And for the first time, rifle companies would ride forward inside armored hulls. The converted Priests, soon nicknamed Kangaroos after the Australian marsupial, rolled into assault positions before midnight. Each vehicle carried 10 to 12 infantrymen, seated on benches, rifles ready. Crews positioned radio sets and added simple climbing rungs to allow rapid dismounting. The modifications were rough, improvised, built for immediate utility rather than long-term refinement. But they worked. At 0230 hours on the 8th of August, Totalize began. 1,000 heavy bombers struck German positions. Artillery laid a rolling barrage. Armored columns advanced under searchlight illumination. And inside the Kangaroos, Canadian infantry rode forward in protection, crossing the killing ground at tank speed, arriving at their objectives with full strength intact. German defenders reported confusion. They saw armored vehicles advancing, but the silhouettes did not match known tank types. Some held fire, expecting heavier targets. Others engaged, but the Kangaroos shrugged off small arms fire and fragments. Infantry dismounted under armor, forming up in covered positions, then assaulting with the surprise of fresh troops arriving where the enemy expected exhausted survivors. The first use proved the concept. Totalize demonstrated that protected infantry delivery worked in combat. Demand followed immediately. If workshop conversions could provide this capability in days, then more conversions would provide it in volume. The Kangaroo was no longer an improvisation. It was an operational necessity. But the Priests were few. The next wave of conversions would come from Canada's surplus rams, the tanks that never fired their guns, about to become the armored carriers that would reshape infantry warfare for the next 70 years. The night of the 7th of August 1944 began with searchlights. Canadian artillery battalions positioned their lights to reflect off low clouds, creating artificial moonlight over the battlefields south of Caen. At 0230 hours, over 1,000 Royal Air Force heavy bombers struck German positions in a rolling carpet. Then the barrage began, 400 guns firing in coordination, walking shells forward at a pace matched to advancing armor. 1st Canadian Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron moved to start lines in the darkness. Each converted Priest carried 10 riflemen from Canadian infantry brigades, men accustomed to crossing open ground on foot, now seated inside armored hulls. The Kangaroos formed up in columns behind Sherman tanks, engines idling, crews checking radios one final time. At each hour, the advance began. Tanks rolled forward, infantry carriers following close behind. German observers saw the movement through the dust and smoke but could not identify the vehicle types clearly. Reports passed back to the 12th SS Panzer Division, large numbers of armored vehicles advancing, possibly new tank variants. Anti-tank crews held fire for clearer targets. The Kangaroos crossed the first phase line without significant losses. Artillery fire bracketed the columns, but the carrier's armor defeated splinters and small-caliber hits. At pre-designated dismount points, infantry climbed out using improvised rungs, formed up behind the vehicles, then advanced on their objectives with full squad strength. The protected approach had worked. Casualties during movement approached 0. German after-action reports noted confusion. Defending units expected to engage infantry on foot during their most vulnerable approach phase. Instead, armored carriers delivered troops to assault positions already formed and ready. The tactical surprise compounded the shock of the rolling barrage and bomber strikes. Canadian infantry cleared objectives that German planners had expected to hold for days. Falaise did not achieve all its objectives. German resistance stiffened, and follow-up delays allowed defensive positions to reform. But the Kangaroo concept passed its combat debut. Reports reached Corps headquarters within hours. Protected transport preserved infantry strength, maintained assault momentum, and reduced casualties during movement by over 70% compared to foot advances. By the 9th of August, requests for more Kangaroos flooded staff channels. Infantry brigades wanted armored lift for every rifle company. Armored divisions requested carriers to support mechanized operations. Simon's improvisation had become a requirement, and the few dozen converted priests could not meet demand. The solution lay in the storage depots of southern England. Hundreds of ram tanks sat preserved and idle, their turrets mounting guns that would never fire in combat, their hulls providing armor and mobility that infantry desperately needed. Orders went out: begin ram conversions immediately. Priority: operational issue within 2 weeks. Field workshops near can set up conversion lines under canvas. Fitters torched off ram turrets at the turret ring, cutting through the mounting bolts and lifting away the entire assembly. Gun, sights, cupola, and all. Welders plated over the turret ring with steel, creating a flat deck. Crews fitted simple bench seats along the hull sides, repositioned radios from turret positions to hull mounts, and added climbing rungs for rapid dismounting. Some hulls received stowage racks for ammunition and rations, allowing Kangaroos to serve as forward resupply as well as troop carriers. The conversions required 2 to 3 days per vehicle when workshops operated at full tempo. By mid-August, workshops were completing ram Kangaroos at rates of 10 to 15 per day. Each vehicle added another rifle squad to the protected inventory, another 10 men who could advance under armor instead of on foot. Canadian forces consolidated their carrier capability. 1st Canadian Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron expanded, absorbing more vehicles and crews. The priest conversions remained in service, but rams became the primary platform, more numerous, mechanically reliable, and available in volume from British depots. By late August, after 2 weeks of intensive workshop effort, the Canadian Army fielded over 100 ram Kangaroos. Each vehicle represented a tank hull repurposed, a gun turret removed, and an infantry squad given protection. The transformation was complete. Canada's obsolete tank had found its battlefield at last, not through firepower, but through the simple utility of moving men safely across ground the enemy controlled. A field workshop near can operated under canvas in late August 1944. Fitters worked around the clock, moving ram hulls through conversion in assembly line fashion. Cutting torches burned through turret rings. Cranes lifted away gun assemblies. Welders sealed the openings with plates. Within 72 hours, a tank became a troop carrier. The process was industrial improvisation, not elegant but effective. Each ram arrived preserved from storage, cosmoline coating the hull, tracks, and suspension in ready condition. Crews steam cleaned the armor, then moved the hull into position. The turret came off first. Cutting the mounting bolts took an hour. Lifting the turret assembly required a crane or a heavy-duty hoist. Once clear, fitters welded a plate over the ring, creating a flat surface where the turret had Saturday. Interior modifications followed. Bench seats went along each side of the hull, bolted to the floor. Stowage racks attached to the walls for ammunition, rations, and personal kit. The radio relocated from its turret position to a mount inside the hull, accessible to the vehicle commander. Climbing rungs welded to the rear hull allowed infantry to board and dismount quickly. The specifications reflected battlefield lessons. Each ram Kangaroo carried 10 to 12 infantrymen, fully equipped. Armor thickness ranged from 25 mm on the deck to 87 mm on the glacis, sufficient to defeat 50 caliber machine gun fire at any range and artillery splinters from anything short of a direct hit. The Continental R975 engine, rated at 400 horsepower, gave the Kangaroo the same mobility as a Sherman, 40 km/h on roads, dependable cross-country performance, and the ability to keep pace with armored columns during advances. Reliability proved critical. The Ram's automotive system had been tested thoroughly during 2 years of training use. Engines, transmissions, and suspensions operated at proven standards. Crews knew the maintenance schedules. Supply chains stocked the right parts. When a Kangaroo needed service, the same mechanics who maintained Shermans could handle the repairs, using many of the same procedures and components. Production tempo accelerated through late August. Contemporary studies describe workshop outputs reaching 15 Ram conversions per day during peak periods. Orders specified batches of 50 or 100 vehicles, with delivery timelines measured in days. Within 2 weeks of the Totali's debut, workshops had completed enough Kangaroos to equip multiple infantry brigades with protected lift. Technical notes from the period highlight small field modifications. Climbing rungs became standard after crews found that dismounting over the sides took too long under fire. Stowage racks adapted to carry more than personal kit, ammunition crates, water cans, rations for extended operations. Some vehicles received additional radios to serve as mobile command posts. Others fitted stretcher brackets, allowing Kangaroos to evacuate wounded under armor. The conversion concept spread. Staff officers from other formations visited the workshops, observed the process, and requested similar capabilities for their own units. By early September, requests for Kangaroos exceeded available ram hulls in forward areas. Orders went back to British depots. Ship more rams, increase conversion rates, prioritize operational issues. The logistics chain responded. Depots at Borden and Chilwell released rams from preservation. Rail transport moved hulls to channel ports. Cross-channel shipping delivered them to Normandy. Forward workshops received vehicles, completed conversions, and issued finished Kangaroos to combat units within a week of the hull leaving England. The factory for a new vehicle type was not a purpose-built production line. It was a tented workshop, a crew of fitters with cutting torches and welding equipment, and a steady supply of tank hulls designed for a different war. The engineering was minimal. The impact was transformational. Armor that had been idle for 2 years suddenly became the most in-demand equipment on the front. By the end of August 1944, the Kangaroo was no longer an improvisation. It was doctrine written into attack plans, assigned to specific infantry units, integrated into combined arms operations. Rifle companies expected armored lift. Tank regiments coordinated with carrier squadrons. Artillery adjusted fire plans to account for infantry arriving at objectives inside armor, not on foot across open ground. A workshop improvisation had become a battlefield requirement. And the demand continued to grow. Major General Percy Hobart commanded 79th Armored Division, the British formation responsible for specialized armor flail tanks for minefields, bridging tanks for obstacles, assault engineers' vehicles for fortifications. In September 1944, Hobart inspected the Canadian Kangaroo operations and recognized their potential immediately. A vehicle that delivered infantry under armor belonged with his division's other funnies. 79th Armored Division absorbed the Kangaroo concept into its operational portfolio. Administrative control shifted from Canadian improvisation to formal British Army establishment. 49th Armored Carrier Regiment stood up as a dedicated Kangaroo unit, crewed and equipped to support infantry brigades across 21st Army Group. By December, Canadian forces consolidated their own carriers into 1st Canadian Armoured Carrier Regiment, creating parallel organizations on either side of the national boundary within Montgomery's command. The administrative adoption brought logistics, doctrine, and spares into alignment. Kangaroos received official nomenclature. Training standards formalized. Maintenance procedures entered field service manuals. What had begun as a field expedient in early August became a recognized vehicle type by autumn, with dedicated units, supply chains, and tactical employment guidelines. Numbers reflected the expansion. Initial conversions used priests, M7 self-propelled guns stripped of their 105mm howitzers. Sources describe 72 to 78 priest conversions completed in the first weeks. These vehicles earned the nickname defrocked priests, a reference to their transformation from gun carriers to troop transports. But priests were scarce, and Allied artillery needed every M7 for fire support. Rams provided the volume. British depots held hundreds in storage. Conversion required no specialized equipment beyond what field workshops already possessed. By October, approximately 500 Ram Kangaroos had entered service, forming the main fleet for armored personnel carrier operations. The terminology Kangaroo became official usage, appearing in operation orders, unit designations, and vehicle documentation. The transition from priest to ram reflected logistics as much as availability. Priests needed to return to United States Army control for artillery use. Rams had no competing requirement. They were Canadian-built, British-stored, and operationally surplus as gun tanks. Converting rams freed priests for their intended role while providing a more numerous platform for the carrier mission. 79th Armored Division integrated Kangaroos into combined arms teams. Tank regiments advanced with carrier squadrons in support. Infantry rode forward in protected lift, dismounting at pre-planned positions coordinated with artillery fire and tank maneuver. Engineers used Kangaroos to bring equipment and demolitions forward under armor. The vehicles became general-purpose battlefield taxis, moving anything that needed protection during transit. German intelligence reports noted the presence of unfamiliar armored vehicles in Allied formations but struggled to classify them accurately. Some observers mistook Kangaroos for new tank variants. Others reported them as supply vehicles or recovery hulls. The confusion persisted because the German military had no equivalent. Their doctrine did not include heavily armored, fully tracked troop carriers. Half-tracks filled the role in the Wehrmacht, but those vehicles offered minimal protection and lower cross-country mobility. Allied success with Kangaroos created a capability gap the Germans could not easily close. Their factories produced tanks and assault guns, not armored personnel carriers. Converting existing vehicles would require time, tooling, and industrial capacity already stretched thin. By the time German commanders recognized the tactical value of protected infantry transport, the Allies had fielded hundreds of Kangaroos and formalized their use in doctrine. The administrative adoption also ensured sustainability. Purpose-built carrier regiments meant dedicated crews, trained specifically for infantry transport operations. Maintenance sections stocked spares. Supply chains allocated fuel and ammunition. Training programs taught dismount drills, radio procedures, and coordination with infantry units. The Kangaroo became an institutionalized capability, not a field expedient dependent on improvisation. By late September, 49th Armored Carrier Regiment operated as a divisional asset, tasked by Corps headquarters to support operations across the front. 1st Canadian Armored Carrier Regiment functioned similarly within Canadian forces. Both units maintained high operational readiness, with vehicle availability rates above 80%, a testament to the Ram's mechanical reliability and the standardized supply chains that supported Sherman family vehicles. An ad hoc Canadian fix had become a British Army capability. The Kangaroo was now as much a part of 21st Army Group as the Sherman, the Churchill, or the Universal Carrier. And its influence would only grow as operations pushed deeper into Northwest Europe. The Falaise pocket closed in late August 1944. German forces retreated eastward, pursued by Allied armor and air power. Canadian and Polish divisions pressed south and east, engaging rearguards and bypassed units. In the confusion of the breakout battles, German commanders struggled to identify Allied vehicle types moving rapidly across the front. A captured German situation report, recovered after the battle, described Allied armored personnel carriers as new United States tanks of unknown type German anti-tank crews, trained to prioritize heavy armor, held fire when Kangaroos passed, waiting for Shermans or heavier targets. The misidentification created tactical delays, allowing infantry columns to reach dismount points without drawing concentrated anti-tank fire. Post-war interrogations of German officers confirmed the confusion. Several noted that Allied vehicles resembling tanks but lacking visible main armament appeared frequently during the August and September battles. Some assumed they were command tanks or recovery vehicles, low-priority targets compared to gun-armed Shermans or Churchills. Others believed them to be a new American design, not yet documented in intelligence summaries. The German military had no doctrinal concept for heavily armored troop carriers. Their experience with half-tracks, the SDKF Z-251 and related vehicles, created expectations of lightly protected, open-top transports. The Kangaroo's heavy armor and fully enclosed hull did not match that pattern. German crews saw the profile, noted the absence of a turret, and made assumptions that proved tactically costly. Allied intelligence collected these reports and recognized the operational advantage. If German anti-tank gunners hesitated before engaging Kangaroos, infantry delivery became even safer. The misidentification was not planned, but it added another layer of protection to an already survivable vehicle. Field reports from Canadian infantry units documented the effect. Rifle companies riding in Kangaroos reported fewer casualties during approaches than comparable advances on foot or in open-topped carriers. German machine gun and rifle fire could not penetrate the hull. Artillery splinters and near-miss explosions caused minimal damage. Only direct hits from anti-tank guns posed serious threats, and those hits came less frequently because German crews prioritized engaging vehicles they recognized as tanks. The intelligence gap extended to tactical understanding. German commanders expected Allied infantry to advance on foot behind artillery barrages, following pre-war assault doctrine. They positioned defenses to maximize firepower against troops crossing open ground at walking speed. When infantry arrived inside armor, moving at tank pace and dismounting under cover at assault range, the defensive calculations broke down. Firepower that would have decimated a rifle company on foot now engaged empty ground while the infantry formed up in protected positions. Allied planners did not advertise the Kangaroo's capabilities. Operational security kept detailed descriptions out of radio traffic. Press coverage, when it occurred, remained vague. The longer German intelligence took to characterize the vehicles accurately, the longer the tactical surprise endured. By October, some German units had updated their target priority guidelines to include turretless armored vehicles as equivalent threats to tanks. But doctrinal updates moved slowly through a military under constant pressure, retreating across France and Belgium. Training new crews, updating recognition manuals, and disseminating tactical lessons required time and resources the German military could not spare. The result was a persistent advantage. Throughout the autumn of 1944, German defenders continued to report confusion when engaging Allied armored personnel carriers. Intelligence gaps, the failure to recognize a new vehicle type, the miscategorization of threats, the absence of effective countermeasures, proved as lethal as armor-piercing rounds. Canadian and British infantry rode forward in protection, delivered to their objectives with strength intact, because the enemy did not fully understand what they faced until it was too late to respond effectively. The Kangaroo's success depended on armor, mobility, and logistics, but it also depended on the enemy's failure to adapt. German doctrine, built around the experiences of 1939 to 1943, had no category for the heavily armored personnel carrier. By the time intelligence caught up, Allied forces had already fielded hundreds of Kangaroos and integrated them into combined arms operations at every echelon. The capability gap had become a doctrinal chasm. Work orders stacked high in British depots through September and October 1944. Chertsey and Aldershot received instructions to release more rams from storage, strip preservation coatings, and prepare hulls for shipment to conversion workshops in France. The demand for Kangaroos exceeded all projections, and supply chains scrambled to keep pace. The conversion economics were compelling. Building a new armored personnel carrier from the ground up would require design work, tooling, factory space, and months of production. Converting an existing ram took 2 to 3 days of workshop time, using equipment and skills already present in field maintenance units. The cost difference was enormous. The time difference was decisive. Sources record rapid production ramps after the 15th of August. Workshops operated continuously, running 3 shifts when fitters and welders were available. Hulls arrived by rail from British depots, moved through conversion in under 72 hours, and entered operational service within a week of leaving storage. By October, hundreds of rams had been converted, and the pace showed no signs of slowing. Logistics commonality simplified sustainment. The ram used the Continental R975 engine, the same power plant installed in early model Shermans. Transmission, final drives, and suspension components shared design families with other vehicles in Allied service. Fuel consumption matched Sherman standards, approximately 0.60 gallons per mile on roads, higher cross-country. Supply officers allocated fuel without needing separate calculations for Kangaroos. They simply counted armored vehicles and issued them accordingly. Spare parts followed similar patterns. Track links, idler wheels, bogie assemblies, engine components, all drew from the same supply system supporting Sherman operations. Mechanics trained on Shermans could service rams with minimal additional instruction. Maintenance intervals aligned. The logistics tail for Kangaroo operations added minimal complexity to brigade and division supply chains. Priests returned to United States Army custody as rams took over the carrier role. The few dozen defrocked priests that had pioneered the concept in August went back into artillery service, their 105mm howitzers reinstalled. By November, Canadian and British summaries recorded that the vast majority of the Kangaroo fleet, approximately 500 vehicles, consisted of rams. The transition was complete. Production numbers reflected battlefield demand. Each infantry division operating in Northwest Europe required enough carriers to lift at least 1 brigade, roughly 3 battalions, or about 30 rifle companies. At 10 men per Kangaroo, that meant 300 carriers per division for a single lift. Providing multiple lifts, reserves, and maintenance float pushed requirements even higher. The Allied forces fielded multiple corps, each with several divisions, all requesting armored personnel carriers. The rams met that demand because they existed in volume and required no new production. British depots held over 1,000 unused hulls. Conversion workshops could process 15 to 20 vehicles per day at peak tempo. Within 2 months, the idle surplus became an operational fleet larger than most countries' entire armored inventories. The sustainability advantage extended beyond initial production. When Kangaroos required service, depots stocked the parts. When they needed fuel, supply columns delivered the same stocks used for tanks. When crews needed training, the vehicles operated with familiar controls and systems. The ram's original design as a gun tank translated directly into reliability as a personnel carrier, because the armor, engine, and running gear performed the same functions regardless of whether a turret sat on top. By November, forward workshops in Belgium and the Netherlands continued converting rams as additional hulls arrived from Britain. The supply pipeline remained active, and operational units requested more carriers as operations expanded. An army had mechanized its infantry without opening a single new production line, without designing a single new vehicle, and without disrupting any existing industrial priority. The Kangaroo fleet grew through repurposing, improvisation, and the willingness to see armor as protection rather than as a platform for guns. The logistics of conversion proved simpler than anyone had predicted. The battlefield value proved greater. And the strategic impact, the ability to deliver infantry under armor at corps scale, operation after operation, reshaped how Allied forces fought through the final year of the war in Europe. The Scheldt Estuary Campaign in October and November 1944 tested the Kangaroo concept under the worst possible conditions. Canadian forces advanced across flooded polders, waterlogged approaches, and fortified positions on the islands controlling access to Antwerp. Trucks bogged down in mud. Wheeled transport could not operate off established roads. Infantry needed mobility and protection across ground that defeated conventional logistics. Kangaroos operated where trucks could not. Their tracks distributed weight, allowing movement across soft ground and through shallow water. Armor protected crews and passengers from artillery splinters and small arms fire. Movement logs showed APC shuttles running continuously, delivering infantry forward and evacuating wounded back, maintaining tempo while truck columns remained immobile on paved roads. The operational advantage was clear. Infantry rode forward at the same pace as tanks and self-propelled guns. Fatigue decreased. Arrival cohesion increased. Rifle companies dismounted at their objectives fresh, formed, and ready to assault. Operational studies from the period cited cautiously, as many remain in archives, noted reduced casualties and higher combat effectiveness when infantry moved under armor. The decisive metric was not speed. Kangaroos moved no faster than trucks on roads. The metric was protection. Armor thickness defeated 20mm fragments and small arms fire at any range. Troops arrived dry in wet weather, rested after long moves, and intact despite German artillery. The Kangaroo turned infantry mobility into a sustainable capability, not a race against attrition. Zuid-Beveland and Walcheren, the islands guarding the Scheldt approaches, fell to Canadian assaults supported by Kangaroo lifts. German defenders, dug into fortified positions and expecting infantry to advance on foot through killing zones, found themselves engaging troops who dismounted from armor at assault range. The protected approach preserved combat power for the decisive close-quarters fighting that followed. By December, the Scheldt was clear. Antwerp opened to Allied shipping. Logistics throughput increased dramatically, easing supply constraints that had slowed operations since September. The campaign succeeded for many reasons: artillery preparation, air support, infantry courage, but the Kangaroo's role was documented and recognized. Armored lift had become indispensable. Doctrine followed. In December 1944, War Office instructions formalized the employment of armored personnel carriers in combined arms teams. Dismount distances, return-to-pickup drills, coordination with tank regiments and artillery, all entered written guidance. The field expedient became official practice, codified in training manuals and tactical publications. 79th Armored Division remained the administrative home for specialized armor, including Kangaroo regiments. 1st Canadian Armored Carrier Regiment consolidated by December, bringing all Canadian carrier assets under unified command. The organizations were permanent, their vehicles allocated and sustained like any other equipment type. Training films appeared, demonstrating proper employment and crew drills. Divisional histories referenced carrier regiments as integral elements of operations. Once written, the method spread. Units receiving Kangaroos adopted the same tactics. Infantry brigades across 21st Army Group expected armored lift as a standard capability. Tank infantry coordination included carrier squadrons in planning. The Kangaroo was no longer novel. It was normal. The spread of doctrine occurred faster than vehicle production. Units requested more Kangaroos than workshops could deliver, even with hundreds already in service. Demand exceeded supply through the winter, and some infantry brigades continued operating with partial carrier support. But the principle was established. Protected mobility for infantry was doctrine, not improvisation. The tactical lessons extended beyond Northwest Europe. Reports reached Allied commands in the Mediterranean, the Pacific, and planning staff preparing for future operations. British, Canadian, and United States observers studied the Kangaroo operations and drew conclusions about armored infantry delivery. Some of those conclusions would influence post-war vehicle design for the next 40 years. By early 1945, the Kangaroo fleet numbered over 500 vehicles, concentrated in British and Canadian formations under Montgomery's command. Each vehicle represented a rifle squad moving under armor, a casualty prevented, a tactical advantage sustained. The capability had been written into doctrine, supported by logistics, and proven in combat from Normandy to the Scheldt. The next test would come at the Rhine, the largest river crossing in Western Europe, and the final barrier before Germany itself. War Office instructions issued in December 1944 carried the weight of official doctrine. The document, distributed to division and corps staff across 21st Army Group, codified the employment of armored personnel carriers in combined arms operations. Dismount distances, typically 75 to 200 meters from the objective, depending on terrain and enemy fire. Return to pickup drills. Carriers move to pre-designated rally points after dismounting infantry, ready to extract or reposition forces. Coordination. Carrier squadrons integrate with tank regiments, operate under division control, and support infantry brigades on tasking. The formalization represented a transformation. 2 months earlier, the Kangaroo had been a workshop improvisation. Now it was doctrine with standard procedures, training requirements, and operational guidelines. Staff officers planning attacks included carrier assets in their orders. Infantry battalions rehearsed dismount drills. Tank regiments coordinated movement with carrier squadrons to ensure infantry kept pace with armor during advances. 79th Armored Division absorbed the Kangaroo regiments into its structure alongside flail tanks, bridging vehicles, and assault engineer platforms. The division's mission remained the same: provide specialized armor to support conventional forces. But the Kangaroo was less specialized than complementary. It filled a gap in combined arms operations that no one had fully recognized until battlefield necessity forced the question. By December, 1st Canadian Armored Carrier Regiment had consolidated all Canadian carrier assets under single command. The regiment operated as a core asset, tasked by headquarters to support operations across the front. Vehicle strength approached 200 Kangaroos, with maintenance float and reserves bringing total holdings higher. Operational readiness remained above 75%, testimony to the Ram's mechanical reliability and the effectiveness of supply chains supporting Sherman family vehicles. Training films and tactical publications followed. British Army training establishments produced short films demonstrating carrier employment, dismount procedures, and coordination drills. Infantry schools incorporated the footage into instruction. New units receiving Kangaroos watched the films, then practiced the procedures in exercises before entering combat. The codification accelerated adoption. Units across the 21st Army Group adopted standard tactics rather than inventing local solutions. Brigade staff used common terminology. Radio procedures aligned. When divisions transferred between corps, their carrier squadrons operated under familiar guidelines. The improvisation that had begun at Falaise in August became a repeatable, scalable capability by December. Public histories and divisional records from the period reference Kangaroo operations routinely. The vehicles appear in operation orders, casualty reports, and logistics summaries. They had become as ordinary as tanks or artillery, essential, expected, unremarkable in their presence. The rapid normalization reflected both the urgency of battlefield demand and the effectiveness of the capability itself. The written doctrine also shaped how other armies viewed armored infantry transport. British and Canadian experience with Kangaroos reached United States observers, who noted the tactical advantages and began considering similar capabilities for their own formations. Post-war studies traced the influence of Kangaroo operations on the development of purpose-built armored personnel carriers in the 1950s and 60s. Once written, the method spread faster than new vehicles ever could. Factories took months to produce equipment. Doctrine spread through printed orders, training films, and operational examples. Units without Kangaroos adopted the tactics in preparation for receiving vehicles. Staff planned operations assuming carrier support, even when actual delivery lagged behind requirements. The gap between doctrine and availability created friction. Some infantry brigades operated with only partial carrier support through the winter. They received enough Kangaroos to lift 1 battalion, not 3. Commanders adjusted by shuttling vehicles, moving 1 battalion forward, returning to pick up the next, then the third. The method worked, but it was slower and more vulnerable than simultaneous lifts across an entire brigade. Workshops continued converting Rams to close the gap. By early 1945, carrier strength approached 600 vehicles across British and Canadian forces. Enough existed to support major operations with multiple brigade lifts. The industrial base, repurposing surplus hulls through field conversions, had caught up with doctrinal requirements. The formalization of Kangaroo employment marked the point where battlefield improvisation became institutional capability. From that moment forward, Allied infantry in Northwest Europe expected to advance under armor, not on foot. The expectation changed how operations were planned, how attacks were executed, and how casualties were calculated. The Kangaroo had reshaped infantry warfare, and the impact would endure far beyond 1945. Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine River, began on the 23rd of March, 1945. The British Second Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, prepared the assault with meticulous planning. Timed smoke barrages, artillery programs firing thousands of shells per minute, bridging schedules coordinating engineers and armor, and airborne drops to secure the far bank. All elements synchronized to overwhelm German defenses along Europe's most formidable river barrier. Kangaroos received chalk marks assigning them to specific lifts. 15th, Scottish Division and 51st, Highland Division veteran formations with experience dating back to North Africa and Sicily would lead the assault crossings. Each division had carrier support from 79th Armored Division, enough vehicles to lift lead battalions under armor once bridging allowed tracked vehicles to cross. German defenses anticipated the crossing. The Wehrmacht fortified the eastern bank with bunkers, trenches, and pre-registered artillery zones. Their planning assumed Allied infantry would cross in boats, land exposed on open riverbanks, and advance on foot while vulnerable to defensive fire. Engineers would need hours to construct bridges strong enough for armor. That interval between the initial assault and the arrival of tank support represented the window where German firepower could defeat the crossing. Plunder overturned those calculations. British engineers began bridging operations under cover of darkness and smoke. By dawn on the 24th of March, the first tank-capable bridges opened to traffic. Sherman tanks crossed, followed immediately by Kangaroos carrying assault infantry. The Germans faced not exhausted troops clinging to exposed positions on the riverbank, but fresh infantry arriving inside armor, dismounting under cover, and assaulting with full squad strength. Major histories of Plunder record the scale and preparation of the operation. Over 3,000 artillery pieces fired in support. Airborne divisions, United States 17th and British 6th, dropped east of the Rhine to secure crossroads and interdict German reinforcements. Naval support, adapted from amphibious doctrine, coordinated river crossings with the precision of a beach assault. The Kangaroo capability fit within this larger orchestration, but it played a critical role, delivering infantry to objectives without exposing them to the killing ground German defenders expected to dominate. Wessel and Rheims, the German towns anchoring the defense line, fell within 36 hours. British infantry, riding forward in Kangaroos and dismounting at pre-planned positions, cleared fortified zones with speed that surprised German defenders. The protected delivery reduced initial assault attrition. Infantry companies arrived at their objectives near full strength, formed and coordinated, ready to exploit momentum immediately after dismount. The Rhine crossing succeeded for many reasons. Allied air superiority prevented German reinforcement. Artillery fire suppressed defensive positions. Airborne drops disrupted communications and logistics. But the ability to move infantry under armor across the bridgehead, maintaining tempo and preserving strength, contributed directly to the speed of the Allied advance. By the 25th of March, the British Second Army had secured a bridgehead several kilometers deep. Armor flowed across the bridges, followed by infantry in carriers, trucks, and on foot. The initial assault phase, the most vulnerable period, when defensive fire could inflict maximum casualties, had passed with losses far below German expectations. Post-war assessments credited careful planning, material superiority, and combined arms coordination for the success of Plunder. The Kangaroo's role appeared in operational summaries and unit histories, noted as part of the armored support that enabled rapid consolidation of the bridgehead. The vehicle had become ordinary enough that its presence required no special emphasis. It simply appeared in the order of battle like tanks and artillery, a standard element of British and Canadian operations. Europe's largest river barrier had fallen to planning, and to infantry who arrived inside armor. The Rhine crossing represented the culmination of doctrine developed over 8 months, from Totalize in August to Plunder in March. Kangaroos had proven effective in hedgerow fighting, in urban combat across flooded polders, and now in opposed river crossings. The capability had scaled from improvisation to institutional standard, from a few dozen vehicles to over 600, from field expedient to written doctrine. The war in Northwest Europe had less than 6 weeks remaining. But the Kangaroo's influence would extend far beyond May 1945. The lessons learned, the tactics developed, and the concept proven heavily armored, fully tracked infantry carriers would shape military vehicle design for decades to come. May 1945. Northwest Europe. The war ended with German surrender, and Allied formations conducted end-of-campaign inventories. Equipment returns listed hundreds of Ram and Priest Kangaroos still in service, vehicles that had crossed from Normandy to the Rhine, surviving 8 months of continuous operations. The numbers told a story of industrial efficiency. Canada built the Ram as a gun tank. Allied logistics rendered that role obsolete. Workshop improvisation transformed the hull into an armored personnel carrier. The Kangaroo outlasted many purpose-built designs, not through superior engineering, but through availability, reliability, and the simple utility of moving troops under protection. Post-war analyses credited the Kangaroo as the first successful, heavily armored, fully tracked troop carrier in Commonwealth service. Earlier experiments with armored infantry transport had used half-tracks or lightly protected vehicles. The Kangaroo provided Sherman-level armor, full cross-country mobility, and seating for a rifle squad. It proved that infantry could operate alongside armor, maintaining tempo and reducing casualties, if transport matched tank protection and speed. The influence extended beyond Commonwealth forces. United States Army observers studied Kangaroo operations and recommended similar capabilities for American formations. Soviet forces, facing similar problems with infantry mobility in armored offensives, developed their own solutions, often by converting obsolete tanks into personnel carriers. The concept, repurpose surplus armor for infantry transport, became widespread in the post-war period. Canada's redundant tank became a strategic enabler. The transformation occurred through conversion economics and logistics commonality. No new factories, no new designs, no disruption to industrial priorities. Workshops, welding torches, and the willingness to see beyond original purpose created a capability that reshaped infantry tactics. Doctrine followed the weld bead, the practice proved itself in combat, then entered formal guidance. The Kangaroo's service record reflected its origins. Built from surplus, improvised under deadline pressure, refined through battlefield feedback, and sustained through standard supply chains, it succeeded because it solved a real problem with available means. The vehicle was never elegant. It was effective. By mid-1945, Allied forces began demobilizing. Equipment went into storage or disposal. Some Kangaroos returned to depots, their conversions reversed, turrets reinstalled for sale or aid to Allied nations. Others went directly to scrap, their hulls worn out after months of intensive use. A few survived in museums, preserved as examples of wartime improvisation. The Ram never fired its main gun in combat. That fact, repeated in histories and technical studies, defined the vehicle's conventional legacy. But in Kangaroo form, the Ram carried tens of thousands of soldiers, reduced casualties, and reshaped infantry tactics for the industrial battlefield. The impact of those converted hulls exceeded anything the original gun tank design could have achieved. Ottawa and London, 1946 to the 1960s. Staff studies in both capitals traced the lineage of armored infantry vehicles from the Kangaroo to post-war designs. The British developed the FV-432, a purpose-built tracked armored personnel carrier entering service in the 1960s. The United States fielded the M113, an aluminum-hulled carrier that became the standard for mechanized infantry through the Cold War. Both vehicles reflected lessons learned from Kangaroo operations: armor protection, tracked mobility, and integration with tank-led combined arms teams. Pre-war armies viewed infantry as foot mobile. Trucks provided transport to the battlefield, but assault doctrine assumed dismounted advance on foot. Post-war doctrine, shaped by World War II experience, assumed mechanized delivery to the forward line of troops. Infantry would fight from vehicles or dismount under cover at assault range, protected during movement, arriving fresh for combat. The Kangaroo demonstrated that transformation in practice. Its operational record, 8 months of continuous use from August 1944 to May 1945, carrying infantry across northwest Europe from Normandy to the Rhine, proved that armored personnel carriers worked at scale. The capability was not experimental. It was repeatable, sustainable, and tactically decisive. Public histories and vehicle studies linked ram Kangaroo practice to post-war APC development. The defrocked priests and the 500 rams formed the backbone of the wartime carrier fleet. That fleet supported operations at corps scale, across multiple divisions, through varied terrain and combat conditions. The success validated the concept and provided operational data that informed post-war vehicle design. The ram never achieved its intended purpose. It was built to fight as a gun tank, obsolete before production ended. But its conversion to the Kangaroo created a legacy far exceeding the original mission. The ram's mechanical reliability, its commonality with Sherman logistics, and its availability in volume when battlefield necessity demanded a solution. Those factors turned an idle surplus into a capability that reshaped infantry warfare. The Kangaroo's influence persists. Modern mechanized infantry doctrines trace their origins to World War II, when the first heavily armored personnel carriers rolled forward under fire. The vehicles changed designation and improved design, but the principle remained: protect the infantry during movement, deliver them to objectives inside armor, preserve combat power for the assault. Canada's obsolete tank became the foundation for modern armored infantry. The transformation required only imagination, welding torches, and the recognition that armor protects people as effectively as it protects guns. That insight, proven in combat across 8 months in 1944 and 45, changed how armies fight. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.